In the depths of the Antarctic waters, there was a crystal-clear silence, broken only by the rhythmic hissing of air coming out of Mark Anderson's regulator. The cold wrapped around his body even through the protective wetsuit, but he had long since gotten used to that feeling. Antarctica was a special place for diving, harsh, dangerous, yet simultaneously mesmerizingly beautiful. Sunlight pierced through the thick layer of ice, scattering in the water in long beams. They created a mystical dance of light and shadow. Deeper. In the dim light, tiny ice particles sparkled, slowly settling to the bottom like snow in a winter forest. Mark's dive was going according to plan. He moved carefully along the underwater ice ridge, keeping an eye on the oxygen and temperature readings. His attention was focused on the marine life. Schools of krill swayed in the currents, translucent jellyfish. They floated upwards slowly like ghosts, while the rare fish hid slowly among the ice blocks. Suddenly something changed. At the edge of his vision, a dark figure flickered, sharply contrasting against the bright ice masses. Mark froze. His first thought was predator. It could be a leopard seal, which is known to sometimes show aggression towards humans. He slowly turned his head, watching carefully. But no. It was something completely different. In front of him appeared a seal pup, small, graceful, no older than a few months. Its wet gray-black skin shimmered in the light, and its round dark eyes sparkled with intelligence and curiosity. Instead of keeping his distance like most seals do, the pup swam closer. He was acting strangely. He wasn't just studying the unfamiliar guest. It was as if he was trying to get his attention. At first he swam around Mark, in wide circles as if observing. Then it swam closer and unexpectedly nudged his hand with its wet nose. It wasn't aggression or play. In its movement, there was a sense of persistence. Mark narrowed his eyes. His heart was beating a little faster than usual. The seal pup turned and did the same thing, gently nudging him once more. And then it suddenly swam back, as if waiting for a reaction. Something was wrong. He had seen seals many times before. They were curious creatures. Sometimes they would swim up to the divers, but usually playfully. This little one, however, was acting anxiously. Without rushing. This same pup was acting anxiously. He was spinning in place, making sudden movements, as if he wanted to say something. Mark stayed in place, trying to understand what was happening. The pup made another quick lunge forward, gently grabbed it with the teeth of his wetsuit sleeve, and then let go. His eyes were once again fixed on him, like a creature that is silent, begging for help. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. The seal pup clearly wanted something, and he wasn't going to back down until he gets attention. The seal pup led Mark into the open sea, swimming ahead with an anxious urgency. The further they went, the darker and colder the water became. The bright sunlight filtering through the ice shelf was now fading, leaving behind ominous twilight. The pressure was getting stronger. The silence is deeper. The little one moved impatiently, constantly looking back to check if Mark was following him. His movements were sharp, tense, as if he knew that time was running out. The further they drifted away from the ice ridge, the more Mark felt that something was waiting for them up ahead. Suddenly, the seal pup made one last lunge forward, and stopped. His little body was trembling. He was circling in place, his eyes fixed on the dark, motionless figure ahead. Mark swam closer and saw her. A large female seal was lying on the ocean floor, almost completely motionless. Her body was covered with a thick, ugly layer of parasitic shells, a dense crust that seemed to merge with her skin. These parasites were pulling her down, restricting her movement, embedding themselves into her flesh. She was still breathing, but barely. Her sides were slowly rising and falling. Her mouth barely opened in an attempt to breathe. Her eyes, cloudy and tired, barely reacted to Mark's presence. The seal pup dove towards its mother, desperately nudging her with its nose, but she didn't respond. She was dying. A heaviness gripped Mark's chest. Action needed to be taken quickly. He grabbed the knife and made the first cut. The sharp blade slid between the shells, tearing them apart, but they held on tightly. Every movement was slow, exhausting. I had to use force, breaking them off one by one. With each piece torn away, The female seal barely flinched, as if she could hardly comprehend what was happening. Her skin was inflamed and damaged under the parasites, and thin streams of blood dissolved in the water, mixing with the debris that Mark was cleaning up. And suddenly he felt something more terrifying than any danger in these waters. A warning on his oxygen tank. He lowered his gaze. Critically low oxygen level. His breathing became heavier. Time was slipping away faster than he had anticipated. Thoughts were swirling chaotically in his head. He won't make it. There's too much work and too little time. He couldn't stay here any longer, or he would drown next to her. Mark looked at the seal pup. He was still circling around his mother, helpless. His little body trembled with fear. "I'll be back." The words echoed in his mind, like an unspoken promise. He made the final cut, removing another piece of shell. Then he pushed off the bottom with force and shot upwards. He needed help, and he had to find her before it was too late. Mark broke the surface, greedily gulping air, as his lungs burned from the lack of oxygen. He ripped off the regulator, inhaling the icy air, his chest heaving spasmodically. His limbs trembled from exhaustion. But there was no time to rest. He turned sharply, scanning the water. The seal and her pup were still down below, trapped. His hands, numb from the cold, fumbled for the radio. He pressed the transmitter, his voice sounding hoarse. "This is Mark Anderson. The Marine Rescue Team is urgently needed. The seal is in critical condition, suffering from a serious infection caused by parasitic shells, and there may be internal damage. She can't move. The team is needed immediately." The radio crackled with interference. Then a response followed. "Received, Mark. We're sending the rescue team. Arrival time is 20 minutes. Can you keep an eye on her until we arrive?" 20 minutes. That could be too long. He hesitated for just a moment, and then dove back in. The seal's frame was barely holding together. Her massive body is everything. She was still pressed down by the shell crust, and her breathing remained weak and labored. Nearby, the pup anxiously circled, nudging her side, whimpering softly underwater. Mark hung in the water, watching, his heart pounding wildly. "Hang in there, girl, just hang in there." Every few seconds he raised his head, checking if the rescue boat was getting closer. Time dragged on painfully. They needed to hurry. Finally, he saw the small rescue boat coming through the ice-covered water. He was making his way through the ice-covered water. The dull roar of the engine sounded to him like a lifeline. The team members, dressed in insulated wetsuits, were already moving, not even waiting for the ship to come to a complete stop. "Where is she?" shouted one of the rescuers, as Mark, soaked to the bone, struggled to climb aboard. 30 feet down. Mark was breathing heavily. His body was shaking from the cold. "She is being restrained by parasites. She is choking. We need to act quickly." And within seconds, 4 divers jumped into the water, armed with special tools for cleaning and medical equipment. The chief veterinarian, Dr. Smiley Carter, put on her mask and followed them. Mark hurriedly replaced the oxygen tank. His body craved rest, but he couldn't afford that. He had to go back down. The real battle was just beginning. Underwater, the rescue team worked with incredible speed, cutting away the thick layer of parasites. Their shells were sharp and deeply embedded in the skin. The seal. Some were so tightly attached that even after their removal, there were bleeding wounds. Dr. Carter was nearby, checking the animal's vital signs. Her gloved hands gently pressed on the thick fur. "It has a weak pulse. Dehydration. We need to urgently bring her to the surface." Mark and the other divers worked faster. Shell fragments were drifting in the water, exposing the torn skin underneath. Suddenly something went wrong. Dr. Carter frowned, gently pressing on the seal's swollen belly. "Inside, there's something..." Mark was left breathless. Inside, Dr. Carter took out the portable ultrasound scanner. The screen flickered, showing a dark spot in the female's stomach. A foreign object. Mark felt something tightening around his throat. She was struggling to breathe not just because of the parasites, but because of something else. It was killing her, from the inside. There was no choice. They had to lift her up. The team carefully placed the stretcher under her massive, weakened body. Every movement sent shivers through her body. Every touch drained her strength. Is it already too late? The little seal cried out desperately, thrashing in the water. He didn't understand. He just wanted her to move. Mark clenched his fists. We will save her, buddy. We won't leave her. The divers were the first to surface, securing the stretcher to the lifting mechanism of the boat. The water churned. As the female's body was slowly lifted, her wet fur was covered in bleeding wounds and debris. Shells. Mark and Dr. Carter were the last to surface. As soon as they got on board, the team was already by the seal, checking her pulse, breathing, temperature. Every second counted. Dr. Carter's voice broke through the tense silence. We need to operate. Right away. Mark didn't hesitate at all. Do it. The engine roared, and the boat suddenly turned, heading back to the research station. But Mark barely noticed it. He was only looking at the seal, watching, as her ribs, barely rising and falling as she struggles to take in air. He could barely hear the pitiful cries of the pup left in the water, because nothing mattered right now except for one thing, to save her life. The boat sliced through the icy waters at full speed. Its engine roared, drowning out the memory of the Antarctic wind. Mark could hardly feel the sway of the deck beneath his feet. All his attention was fixed on the huge, trembling body of the female seal lying in front of him. She was still breathing, but barely. Her sides were weakly rising and falling, and her body trembled every few seconds. It was as if she was fighting against an invisible force. Her fur was still wet from the ocean water. And through the place, where were the parasitic shells torn off? Raw, bleeding patches of skin were visible. Dr. Carter and her team worked frantically, their gloved hands moving with controlled urgency. A portable oxygen mask was tightly secured on the seal's snout, providing short bursts of air. To stabilize her condition, next to the boat, in the choppy waves, the pup was swimming, its cries sharp and desperate. The little head kept disappearing underwater, and then reappearing. Mark clenched his fists. The little one still didn't understand. His mother was slipping away. Dr. Carter's voice cut through the chaos. It's not just about the parasites. Something else is wrong. She carefully but confidently pressed on the seal's swollen belly. Mark noticed a flicker of distress in her eyes. Her abdominal cavity is tense. She's in pain. Something inside is killing her. Mark felt his throat tighten. He already knew the answer. Even before she said it, something was stuck in her stomach. And judging by how her body was slowly shutting down, it had been there for a long time. We need to operate, Carter continued. Her voice was firm and unyielding. If we wait, she won't survive. Mark nodded. There was no choice. The boat crew acted quickly, securing the seal on the deck. And at the same time, preparing the emergency operating room. Mark helped as much as he could, holding the equipment and stabilizing it. He wiped the freezing condensation off the instruments with the seal's body. His fingers were numb from the cold, but he didn't pay any attention to it. He couldn't afford that. Dr. Carter made the first incision. As soon as the scalpel blade cut through the seal's abdominal cavity, the air filled with a foul, acrid stench. Mark instinctively recoiled. It wasn't just the smell of the wounds, it was something rotting. Something decomposing from the inside. Oh my God, one of the assistants murmured, stepping back. Dr. Carter's expression didn't change, but Mark noticed how her jaw tightened. She carefully slid her hands inside the wound. Her fingers disappeared into the seal's abdominal cavity. Seconds dragged on, like a clock. Then her whole body tensed up. I found it, she said. The team held their breath as she slowly pulled the object out. At first, it looked like a dark, slimy mass, but when she lifted it higher into the cold Antarctic air, Mark saw what it actually was. A huge tangled ball of fishing net, its knots twisted and stained with gastric juices, partially dissolved. The thin plastic fibers were solid and saturated with toxins. Their surface had changed after months, or maybe even years of slow decomposition inside her body. Mark felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. He had seen marine animals, tangled in nets, but this. It was different. This net was killing her from the inside. Dr. Carter placed the disgusting clump of plastic on a sterile tray, and her eyes flashed with anger. It had been inside her for too long. The plastic started to break down. The toxins had already entered her blood. Now everything was becoming clear. Paralysis. A slow suffocation. Weakness. She was dying long before the parasites covered her body. And all of this because of one discarded piece of plastic that was floating in the ocean. Like a silent killer. Mark clenched his fists. He was shaking. He almost lost her. And for what? Because someone was careless. Because yet another fishing net was just thrown into the water without a second thought. In the aftermath. But Carter wasn't done yet. She carefully checked the internal tissues. She examined the seal, checking for any other injuries. Her movements were quick, but precise. The team worked in silence. The tension hung in the air. Mark felt it in every person around him. They all knew the truth. It wasn't nature. It's human negligence. Finally, Dr. Carter said, she's still not out of danger. The toxins have already spread. We need to start treatment immediately. At the command, the whole group sprang into action. They administered an IV with saline to the seal. To cleanse her system, they prepared an urgent dose of antibiotics. As soon as the first injection was given, the seal's body jerked convulsively. Her muscles spasmed, arching her body in painful convulsions. Mark caught his breath. For a moment, he thought she was dying right in front of him. But then slowly, her body began to calm down, and her ribs continued to rise and fall slowly, weakly. But it's stable. Dr. Carter let out a quiet sigh. She's still fighting. That's a good sign. Mark slowly relaxed his shoulders, letting the tension leave his body. He turned to the baby animal, which was still thrashing around near the boat. Its huge eyes were wide with terror. He didn't take his eyes off it for a second. Mark knelt at the edge of the deck. It will be okay, he said. Quiet. Even if the baby didn't understand the words, it probably didn't matter. Maybe Mark just needed to say it. The evening is not over yet. The poison was still in her body. The wounds from the parasites still needed to heal. It will take days, maybe weeks, before she can return to the ocean. But right now she was alive. And what that was enough. The wind howled over the Antarctic Research Station, shaking the metal walls of the temporary Marine Animal Rescue Center. Inside, the sterile air was filled with the steady hum of monitors, interrupted only by the rustling of blankets and the muffled voices of the veterinarians. Mark stood at the edge of the enclosure, arms crossed over his chest, watching the massive body of the female seal resting on the soft platform. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of exhausting rehabilitation, constant monitoring, and unending fear. What if, despite all their efforts, she doesn't survive? The toxins from the fishing net caused more damage than expected. In the first few days she hardly moved. Her body was shaking from spasms, and her eyes remained dull and unfocused. The infection from the parasites spread, and at one point, Mark was sure she wouldn't make it to morning. But she fought. Dr. Carter, she tirelessly worked, administering fluids, antibiotics, and pain relief. The team was on duty around the clock, not leaving her unattended. The cub had been in a separate pool all this time, close enough to see its mother, but not enough to interfere with the treatment. In the first few days, he called for her non-stop, making desperate, plaintive sounds. And then, one morning, everything changed. Mark was getting ready for another long shift when he walked into the center and saw her sitting there. She wasn't just breathing, she was alert, aware, and observing. The cub noticed it too. He excitedly jumped in the pool, pressing against the glass and making joyful sounds. When the team finally allowed them to reunite, he literally knocked her off her feet, pressing against her side and rolling over her flippers. She, although tired, gently responded to him, covering his head with her chin. Mark had never seen anything like it. Now, standing in the quiet rehabilitation area, he slowly exhaled. Today was the day. She is ready. Dr. Carter's voice brought him out of his thoughts. She was standing nearby, holding a tablet in her hands. Her face was expressionless. Mark looked at the female seal. Her fur was clean. The wounds have completely healed. Her body has strengthened, and she no longer needed help to move around. Next to her, curled up in a little ball, her pup was peacefully sleeping. We will return them to where we found them, Carter continued. A familiar environment. Less stress. This is the best chance. Mark nodded briefly. He knew that this moment was inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier. The boat sliced through the icy waters, leaving a frothy trail behind as it approached the very spot where it all began. The sun hung low, casting a silvery shimmer on the surface of the ocean. The air was piercingly cold, but no one on board paid any attention. All eyes were fixed on the two seals at the edge of the deck. The pup wriggled. Slapping its flippers against the wet metal, its body trembled with impatience. His mother, on the other hand, was calm. She sat upright, flaring her nostrils, inhaling the sharp Antarctic air. Her body was tense, but something different was reflected in her eyes. Acknowledgement. Mark stepped forward. He knelt down next to them. He had done this dozens of times, rescuing, healing, releasing. But this time was different. He reached out, gently touching her thick fur. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Come on, girl, he said softly. You are free. As soon as the restraints were removed, the pup burst into motion. He jumped, his little body tumbling wildly in the air. Before splashing into the water, the mother didn't follow right away. For a long moment she remained still. The massive body froze at the edge of the boat. Skian was waiting. The world stood still. And then, with a powerful sweep of her tail, she dove. Quietly. Without a sound. Mark exhaled. That's it. They're gone. He stood there, bracing himself for what always followed such moments. Relief from success mixed with emptiness. They disappeared. Just like that. But suddenly, something unexpected happened. The waters in front of the boat stirred. A shadow, quick and confident. Before anyone could react, Mother! The shadow burst out of the water, soaring into the air. Her body hovered for a moment before crashing back into the waves with a loud splash. The cub appeared a moment later. Desperately mimicking her movement, his little body awkwardly twisted in the air. They were playing. Mark felt a lump rise in his throat. For a brief moment, as she hung in the air, her gaze met his. A moment. Quick, fleeting. A moment that meant nothing and at the same time meant everything. And then she was gone. She disappeared underwater, slipping into the abyss of the ocean. Mark stood still, watching as the ripples spread on the water. The wind stung his face, but he didn't move. No words. Nothing that could be said, but deep down he knew. She said thank you to him,